Hello and welcome to the Faith Under Fire podcast, brought to you by Aid to the Church in Need Ireland. I'm your host, Wendy Grace. In this month's podcast, I will chat to a young Jesuit priest, Father Niall Leahy, about his life, his faith, his vocation and his ministry. Father Nicholas Grace is going to reflect on how best we can share our faith with others. A little bit of apologetics for you today. Later, I will go beyond the headlines, bringing you stories of Christian persecution and indeed stories of hope from around the world. But first, I wanted to talk about how important it is for us as Catholics to make sure we fulfil our mission to share the joy of our faith with others. You know, I get to, through my work, interview a lot of different people in a lot of different circles, and I'm increasingly finding that there is a lot of distress around particular issues and a lack of joy. So let's go back to what Jesus actually told us. He was pretty clear, as we read in John chapter 10, that he came so we may have life and have it abundantly. What does that mean? He's telling us, well, I want you to be happy. I want you to be joyful. Now, it's no coincidence that Jesus gave us this message as he gave his sermon about the Good Shepherd. So he's telling us, this is what I want for you. I want you to have life to the full. And he's saying, and this is how you get it. You follow me. Maybe you're like me and you're having that situation where rather than constantly encountering joy-filled Catholics, you might have found yourself being part of or listening into negativity and being overwhelmed by so many of the issues facing our culture today. And I get it, because I've been there many times myself, and it's hard not to be completely overwhelmed by some of the culture wars that we're seeing today. You know, we live in a world that can increasingly feel so hostile towards a Catholic worldview, whether it's the protection of the unborn or even our basic understanding of the dignity and the complementarity of what it means to be a man or a woman. You might find yourself feeling, well, if I articulate the truth, I'm going to be vilified, I'm going to be cancelled. We even have infighting within the Catholic faith. There's schisms and a lack of heart for what Jesus also asked of us, unity. As we hear in John chapter 17:21, Jesus hoped that they may be one. I'm not saying that it's not important to be educated on some of the issues that I've mentioned. Of course it is. And we have to be able to defend and uphold our own point of view. And we have to be able to do this way where we communicate well. It's not about confrontation. It's about good communication. It's about proposing our worldview rather than imposing it. But if this is all we absorb, if this is all we obsess over, it can happen a lot of the times where there's maybe a particular issue that you're really passionate about and you spend so much time learning about it, but you don't balance that with something that is joyful. You don't balance that with time with the Lord. And if we don't do that balancing act, if all we're doing is absorbing things that get us down and negativity, well, then we're going to be the opposite of what our Catholic faith calls us to be. We're going to be sullen. We're going to be negative. We're going to be fearful. One of the things that Jesus also told us is that Jesus should know Christians by our witness. I mean, how many times, and I have to tell you, I have heard it so many times over the years when people have shared with me their conversion stories, where people have said, you know what, I encountered a person where they just had something. They just had that joy. They just had something that I thought to myself, I want that, whatever it is, I want that. And that curiosity, that joy that people saw, which they thought, I want that, is the thing that made them think about Jesus. When you see that person's true joy that is brought to them by a relationship with Christ, don't get me wrong. Okay, we all need our safe spaces to vent our frustrations, to talk about solutions. But it can be a dangerous thing if we're completely obsessing, as I said, over particular issues. And they take over to the point where we forget our mission to be witnesses to hope, to love, to Jesus Christ. You know, Pope Francis said once in a homily that the Christian community grows sick with worldliness when it does not have the joy of Christ. You know, that phrase that we've often heard, we have to be in the world but not of the world. And that principle applies to some of the things that I've been talking about. Think of the number of times in the Bible that we're told, do not be afraid. It's 365 times, by the way. So if we're fearful, then we haven't really heard Jesus' message. But the good news is we don't have to take on this challenge because it is challenging. And I've just been talking about the general kind of culture wars aside from the ups and downs that just we face personally. But the Holy Spirit gives us the grace, gives us the courage to be joyful in spite of the challenges we in our personal lives and the world in general might face. You know, practically speaking, if we spend time researching and educating ourselves on some of these neuralgic complex issues, then balance that. Balance that with times of goodness, times with adoration, times of prayer, and also the sacraments. Of course, we shouldn't be afraid because the battle has already been won. Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father. So a question maybe to ask yourself is, are you reflecting the light of Christ to others? Or have you lost your Catholic identity and become completely assimilated or indeed overwhelmed by the surrounding secular culture? One of the things that St. Paul does is he reinforces the call to be joyful when he says, rejoice always, pray constantly, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. So it's pretty clear, this is our call of duty. As I've said, it's difficult, but we're not alone. So do everything that you can to be bound to Jesus. Stay close to Our Lady and ask the Holy Spirit for wisdom and guidance. You know, you can do this from the moment that you wake up, just with your simple morning offering the day to Jesus, asking him to guide you, giving him the highs and the lows, the hopes and the hurts of our day, knowing that you can ask him for help whenever you need it. And also remember that joy is actually a fruit of the Holy Spirit. In St. Pope Paul VI's exhortation Evangelii Nuntiandi, he speaks of joyful Christians and joyful evangelizers. And also remember what Nehemiah said to the people. He said, rest assured, now do not cry anymore. Keep the joy, because the joy in the Lord is your strength. And dear friends, that is all we need. So I'm hoping all of us can renew our commitment as Catholics to share the joy of our faith with those around us. So for this month's profile interview, I'm going to be chatting to Father Niall Leahy. He is a native of Blackrock in County Louth. Now, he did move to Dublin in the year 2000, where he studied at UCD, and he did BCommerce, and then he got a Master's in Accounting at the Smurfit Business School. Then he went on to be employed by KPMG, and he spent several years there. But then after that, at the end of his training, he felt something was missing, and he decided he was going to take a year out to help Spirit Radio. And during that year, he found that he was discerning a call to the Catholic priesthood, and it was after that time that in 2009 that he entered the Jesuits. And he's going to talk to us in this interview a little bit about his formation and his faith, and also about his ministry today. And that's what we started off just talking in our chat about, was just his faith growing up.
I grew up in a Catholic family, and going to Mass and prayer was part of our lives, but I suppose until I was a young adult, I wasn't quite sure what I believed. I knew practicing my faith was a good thing and it was something I liked, but I really wasn't sure if it was true or not. So I suppose that changed in my early to mid 20s, when I started attending kind of young adult prayer groups and retreats. And let's say just, the lights came on. After a number of experiences and
what was it that drew you to those places, though? Because, a lot of young people, when they're at that stage, when they're searching, they end up searching in a lot of the wrong places. So what was it that sent you to the right places?
I would say, well, a mixture of things. One of them was, I was making the transition from being a college student to working life, professional life. And I wasn't particularly happy in my job. And I kind of had a sense of, is this it? Is this all there is? And it was such a joy then to discover, no, there is more to life, than just, grinding it out, working hard. And, I think the sort of moral of life in your early 20s for young professionals is often like work hard, play hard. And that isn't really a good recipe for life. So I was really overjoyed to find, a more, let's say, to find the spiritual dimension of life and finding, deeper joys. That was huge. So yeah, I suppose that question, is this it? Or is this it? And I think, more to life?
Yeah, a lot of people have that experience, and especially at that kind of, can be a very tumultuous time, when you're in college and, starting out into adulthood, really, where you're kind of sold this worldly view of, partying, being out, all this sort of stuff. And that gap, that gaping hole that many people find, where they feel like that, I'm not satisfied. So what's missing?
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's like having a career, having, a good social life, all good things, but they don't satisfy the deeper needs.
So tell us a bit more about that
And
journey.
we shouldn't try to make them, just so.
It's that God-shaped hole that only He can fill. Tell us a bit more about that
Exactly.
journey then. So you started kind of engaging in Catholic stuff, prayer groups and things like that. How did your faith develop and grow?
So I suppose there was in adoration, I had some powerful experiences that convinced me of the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, and then I just sort of committed to going to a prayer group once a week, and that's where we met, Wendy. And I knew then that I was. I was working for an accountancy firm, and I knew at the end of my training contract I would need to make a decision. So I decided to take a year out, basically, for God, or give a year to God, and I worked for Spirit Radio for that year, and Spirit was in the process of launching, and I also started seeing a spiritual director. And he was a Jesuit priest, former student chaplain at UCD, and I just said to him, "Look, I want to discern my vocation. I had an inkling that maybe God was calling me to be a priest."
It was a pretty
And
mature decision, though, Father Niall, because I think a lot of people, when they're trying to figure out their vocation, you're kind of it's a tug of war. You're pulled in loads of different directions, and a lot of the time, from my understanding as well, especially from talking to a lot of priests and religious, it's a case of, I'm going to just put the headphones on, la la la. I'm not hearing what you're saying, Lord. But you were so open by the sounds of it. It's just a mature decision to say, here's a year, I need to figure this out.
Yeah, it is scary to do something countercultural and to swim against the tide a little bit. But yeah, I thought, like, my spiritual director, like, he gave me really good advice. Like, he could see that I was torn. And he said, "Niall, the first thing you have to do is not decide what God's calling you to do. It's to become free in yourself, to be able to respond to any call. So that, if you're called to marriage, fine. If you're called to priesthood, fine." And so that was that was a lot of the work, and that's what, like, I'm in vocation promotion now for the Jesuits, and that's sort of the advice I pass on to the young men who I meet. It's like, okay, you have a sense of call, but the real thing to do is kind of cultivate your own, like, the soil of your own heart, and to become freer, to answer whatever the call is. There's work there, and that's what Jesus does. Jesus frees us up. Jesus was free himself, to follow, to do the will of the Father. And that's what Jesus, who's living in us, does for us. He frees us up to do the will of the Father. So
was there a moment for you when you kind of let go of the vocation of married life and realised, yeah, God wants me to be a priest, or was it a process?
It was a process, and yeah, there was definitely a tug of war inside me. I would say, though, when I found the Jesuits, and started, seriously considering entering the order, I discovered a joy in myself and an excitement that really surprised me, because I was reluctant, for sure, to give up family life, having a wife and children, and all that. So I was quite surprised when I found this joy in me, and I wasn't kicking and screaming anymore. I was, like, my prayer changed to, God, I actually really want this. I really hope this is it. So that, I think, was a confirmation in itself, and it was a joy that lasted. It wasn't a flash in the pan. I remember that whole summer of 2009. I was just really happy to tell people that I was joining the Jesuits, and which is a strange thing to be happy about. To be giving up so much and yet to be happy. It shows that Jesus is involved in that in some way.
So you spent many years studying. Tell us a little bit about that, about what happened next when you answered the call.
So I went to Birmingham to do a 2-year novitiate, and the novitiate is, I suppose, it's a mixture of kind of like a semi-monastic life where where you are praying and doing spiritual reading and living kind of in close quarters with the other novices. And then, so that's kind of half the time is that, and then half the time you're sent out to do kind of placements and different experiences. Like I did a walking pilgrimage. I worked in a hospital. I worked in a care center for recovering addicts. So it's kind of half of it's quite sort of spiritual and internal work, and then half of it is kind of apostolic. So that was 2 years. And at the end of that, I took my first vows. And then I studied philosophy in London, which was great. And then I had 2 years of teaching. So we do 2 years of apostolic work in the middle of our formation. And I did mine as a secondary school teacher. I was based in Clongowes Wood College in County Kildare. And then I went to Canada to study theology. I did my basic degree in theology in Canada, in Toronto. And then I did 2 years of study after that, focusing on Laudato Si and the whole question of eco-theology and like the earth and God and a kind of a bigger vision of environmentalism that Pope Francis has articulated in Laudato Si.
Yeah, so you had a long years of study, long years of discernment as well. And every time I talk to a priest or religious, it's interesting because you said there a few minutes ago how you might see it at the time till you're fully assured of your vocation. And indeed how the world sees it is you're giving up so much. And then when I hear about the life and studies of so many priests and religious, wow, it's such an incredible adventure, and the experiences you get to have so many of us could only ever dream of.
It's very rich. It really is. Like there's no doubt about it. Like being in different countries, in different, even just, different situations, like getting to meet people from different walks of life that otherwise I never would meet. And and having good accompaniment all the way. I think that's one of the things I really appreciated, like having a spiritual director who, I can always check in with and speak honestly with, and who helps me sort of stay in tune with God and with the Spirit, and just with myself as well. Somebody I can be transparent with. That's really, a special blessing too.
Yeah, and keeping your spiritual life grounded. So tell us a little bit about the ministry that you're involved in today then, Father Niall.
So I am the parish priest in Gardiner Street Parish, which is in the north inner city in Dublin. And I'm also the vocations promoter for the Irish province of the Jesuits. I think the job here as parish priest after COVID is really to try and get the parish up and running again. Get people back into church, especially young people and families, I would say.
And how are you finding that challenge?
Things are going well. Like I got a shock last year. There was one about a year ago. There was one Sunday morning here, 11 o'clock is our main mass. And I just saw that there were actually no children in mass. And it, that really bowled me over. And I thought, God, the writing's on the wall here, guys. If children aren't coming to mass, eventually your church will close, because, the generations move on and people pass on, and if there's no younger people there to take their place, well then, your church will close. So we made a big effort then. We took in a Net Ministries team this year, and they've really helped, let's say, kickstart our ministry to children. We have special activities now, sort of a children's liturgy at our 11 a.m. mass that the Net team lead, and then also our Sunday evening mass has a more youthful feel to it. It's not just for young people, but it's kind of animated by young people, music, servers, readers, everybody. Like it's a mass sort of made by young people, and a homily that's directed more at them. So bit by bit we're seeing new faces, we're seeing younger faces, and we're seeing, like, I'm really happy to see happy young faces and like happy young children. Like they sort of have a vibrancy and a life which is just good for everyone. Yeah, so that's one of the things I'm really happiest about.
What do you think is the best way to do that though, Father Niall? Because so many people listening would echo some of your experiences in terms of when they go to mass, saying there's very few young people, children, And how do we, and also shared that experience of, I know myself, just chatting to many families who maybe would have gone to Mass pre-COVID and have fallen out of the habit now. What has worked for you so far? And I know it's obviously a work in progress. Net Ministries obviously has had a huge impact, but what are some of the things you think that really helps encourage particularly young people and families back to Mass?
I would say the first thing is that you really have to make it a priority, in your parish, and you have to start somewhere. You have to look at, find out what other parishes are doing. Like some parishes have like a family mass where the like all the young people and the kids like stay in the congregation, and everything is sort of oriented towards them. Others, do it like ourselves, where children are taken out for the liturgy of the word and have special activities. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to, and the time of the mass is important as well. When does it actually suit parents to bring their children to mass? So you need to consult with parents and ask them, what works for you, rather than whatever the priest or the parish pastoral council saying, let's try this. So, but before you try anything, I'd say consult with parents and ask what would make it work for you, and then take it from there.
Yeah, talking to parents and talking to families is a great start for sure. Father Niall, later on in this podcast, we'll talk about different stories from around the world, many of them involving the persecution of Christians. But often when I talk to people in Ireland, they talk about, a social persecution that's happening here. You're a young priest, you're working in a busy church in Dublin. And as we've talked about, you're trying to engage young people, you're trying to engage families. Has that been your experience? Has it been a positive one or a negative one?
I would say on the whole, it has been positive, because, when I talk to people and I tell them, I'm a priest in the North Inner City, they say, oh, that's a rough area. And yeah, I mean, there's certainly social problems here. But by and large, the people who come into the church are just wonderful. Like, I really feel like I'm working with the best of people every day, and people who come into church are happy to see me. So on a day-to-day basis, it's fine. Like, if I'm walking down the street and I'm wearing, my clerical collar, I'll get some strange looks, or people might take two, or but like, I wouldn't say I get persecuted in any way. People are still, I think there's still a sort of a spirit in Ireland of live and let live, even if somebody doesn't believe anymore, or doesn't subscribe to Catholic worldview. On the street, I find people fine. I think things probably are nastier on social media, so I steer clear of that, to be honest. And yeah, I mean, Ireland's going through a big transition at the moment, a big social transition, and obviously there's the history of the Church in Ireland has many lights and many shadows, and it's going to take time, I suppose, for us to figure out our new relationship and what that looks like. I just think it's really important for us to sort of stay the course, and that's the one thing the church is really good at, I think, is just sort of persevering and keeping going, regardless of the changing social situation. The other thing I would say is that in this part of Dublin, a lot of people, when they first move to Ireland from abroad, if they've emigrated from home and they've come to Ireland as migrants, the inner city is often a place where they land, and so I would say that a growing percentage of our congregation were not born in Ireland. They're migrants who have come here for work or whatever, and they bring their faith with them. So that's, I mean, I think that's something that probably Irish people are learning as well, is that as our country becomes more ethnically diverse, it's also becoming more of a religious country, because people coming from Brazil, Latin America, Africa, Philippines, Asia, like they're often Catholics. That's certainly a source of life for our church at the moment.
Yeah, God has a plan to build up the church. It is the year of vocation at the moment, Father Niall. For anybody listening, you shared a little bit about your own vocation. So far, would you recommend being a priest, or what would you say to somebody considering it?
I would say give it a go. If there's any young man out there who suspects or has an inkling that God may be calling him to the priesthood, I'd say give it a go. Like that's what really moved me at the beginning was, I want to know either way. And no more than, when you're trying to find a husband or a wife, you have to go on a few dates and you have to put your toe in the water. And ultimately the test is, well, try it. And if you're happy, well, then that's it. You're happy. And you stay. But if you never try, you'll never know. That would be my basic advice to any young person, young man who thinks he may be called.
Are you hopeful for the future of faith in Ireland based on your experience so far?
I suppose, yes and no. I think the church is going to be much smaller. What I would like to see happening is that we become more missionary focused. I still think, sorry, one of the things I'd like to see happen is, well, that really needs to happen, is that we become more missionary focused and more focused on outreach and welcoming new people into our churches rather than just maintaining our churches. There's a lot of energy still goes into ministering to the regular mass goers and people of faith. And I'd love to see our parishes anyway more oriented towards welcoming people who don't believe, and having events for them. Like mass is not designed for evangelization. It's mass is for the people who believe, who are sort of already signed up. And I think we need more activities in our churches, which
that sense of outreach, like you're saying. And it's a really interesting point.
It's easy to invite people to.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I was discussing it with another priest recently, saying, look, if you didn't believe, and you mentioned your experience of realizing, wow, Jesus is really present in the Eucharist. If you didn't believe in what is happening in the Mass, if you didn't believe that Jesus Christ was resurrected, why would you go? Why would you give up your hour on a Sunday morning? There's no reason to. So are we putting the cart before the horse sometimes?
Yeah. I don't think more mass is the answer. And so am I hopeful about the future? Well, I think the future of faith in Ireland really depends on us making that shift and develop, being more imaginative about what activities we have in our churches. If we don't make that shift towards more outreach, then I would say the future is bleak. But if we do, well then, why not? I think ultimately people are looking for the gospel.
Do you think they're hungry? Do you think they're hungry for the message?
Oh, clearly. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose in some way there does seem to be a lot of religious apathy out there. People are really investing in other areas of their lives, whether it be career or, the gym or diet or, some lifestyle thing, religion is pretty down the list of priorities. I think the hunger and the desire, it becomes more apparent when when things don't work out, and then that can often get people questioning and searching again. So that's the story of Christianity. That's the story of us all.
Father Niall, it's been a pleasure to have you on the Faith Under Fire podcast. I've been talking to Father Niall Leahy, a Jesuit priest and parish priest in Gardiner Street Parish. And also you can check out Father Niall's very own podcast, Sons of Ignatius, wherever you get your podcast. Father Niall, thanks for being with us today. And now it's time to go beyond the headlines. So this is the part of the podcast where I bring you stories of Christian persecution from around the world that are often underreported or totally ignored by the mainstream media. I also try to bring you stories of hope as well. And I wanted to turn now to Nigeria. Again, it's one of those stories that when you read the detail, you wonder how on earth it isn't reported more in the mainstream media. Yet I had to go to various different Christian news websites to find this story. And this is about a recent study that has found upwards of 52,000 Christians have been murdered in Nigeria since the Boko Haram insurgency began nearly 14 years ago. Now, this report was entitled Martyred Christians in Nigeria, and it was published by Nigeria's persecution watchdog, which is the International Society for Civil Liberties and Rule of the Law. It's also called Intersociety. Now, according to their research, as I said, over 52,000 Christians have been brutally killed by Islamist militants for non-violently professing their faith. And the period that they were looking at, that they were documenting, was July 2009 up to April 2023. And what they found was that 9,250 Christian massacres were recorded after July 2021 and over 5,000 in 2022. When we look at just this year alone, in just the first 100 days of 2023, Intersociety said that 1,041 Christians were slaughtered by jihadists and a further 707 have been kidnapped. Now, the predominantly Christian Benue state has the highest record of Christian deaths for this year at 380. One of the things that this particular report claims is that it was the installation of President Muhammad Buhari, and he was installed as president in 2015, that has added to the fueling of these anti-Christian attacks. And one of the things that they highlight is that 30,250 Christians have been killed, 18,000 churches and 2,200 Christian schools have been set on fire since this leader came to power. During his presidency, the Muslim leader has been accused of promoting radical Islam by not dealing harshly enough with Islamist terrorist groups and also endorsing Sharia law across the northern states of Nigeria. So when you think of Boko Haram and Islamic extremists and government-protected jihadi Fulani militants, they are posing such a threat to Christians in Nigeria, particularly in the northern part of the country. One of the other impacts of this not only has been the loss of life, but it's also forcing Christians to flee their homes. About 14 million Christians have fled or uprooted from their homes, also according to this report from Intersociety. Aid to the Church in Need has done much research on this, and indeed I've covered it a lot on the podcast as well. One of the things that Aid to the Church in Need has highlighted recently is that more Christians are killed in Nigeria than anywhere else in the world. And yet the focus on this particular issue, as I said, in the mainstream media and certainly in Western governments seems to fall on deaf ears. So what can we do? Well, we have to write to our political leaders and indeed write to embassies in our countries, write to the Nigerian embassies, pleading with them to recognise this as such a huge issue. The fact that more Christians are losing their life and are persecuted than anywhere in the world than in Nigeria. This next story brings us to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's a few things that are important to highlight in this story. One of the main things is just the dire situation for prisoners in the area of Bukavu, but also the area of prison ministry of priests ministering as chaplains to those who are in prison. You know, there's so many areas in the ministry of religious sisters and priests that often, you know, this self-sacrifice, this area of service is just not highlighted enough. And I think this story just reminds us of that. So Aid to the Church in Need was recently in conversation with the priest, Father Adrian, who ministers to prisoners in Bukavu. Now, in the Bukavu Central Prison, it's something that's really unimaginable to us in terms of just the conditions conditions that these prisoners are in. The entrance hall is this dilapidated building, and it's really interesting because the prison director, one of the first thing he joked about was he's not the real boss of the prison. He is, pointing to Father Adrian, and it just shows the impact that his ministry has. In terms of the prisoners that he's there, he comes to visit, of course, and minister to them, and they gather around him and they greet him, and he's walking across the courtyard with its worn cement floor, and it's so crowded, and he knows the inmates by their first names. Get your head around this though. There's 2,147 people living within those walls, and it's only designed to accommodate 500. And Father Adrian was summing up the situation quite well when he said that there's just not enough room for everybody. There isn't enough food. In fact, they're actually short of everything. And he was explaining that the daily ration of maize that the government gives to each prisoner, and how it works is that's to satisfy kind of basic hunger. But the prisoner has to pay extra to the merchants who have access to the prison. But one of the things that he said is thankfully there is Christian organisations that distribute free food to supplement the menu, but of course they can't be there every day. One of the things that is most evident and that Father Adrian really tries to impress upon us is just the lack of resources in the overcrowded cells. Again, this is hard to imagine, but they don't have electric light or windows. So there's 300 inmates sleeping huddled together on iron sheets or bunk beds, or indeed on the bare floor. And whether it's day or night, they don't know, because the darkness is so complete that it actually takes a while for the eyes to adjust to realise there's actually people living in that space. And it's only really the flash of a camera that in this conversation reveals the distraught eyes staring into space. Can you imagine what it must be like? Even though the sun is shining outside the courtyard, he says that some of the inmates don't go out. They're staying in their cells because of a state of numbness and the dramatic consequences that this prolonged period of living in such conditions has. One of the other things that he highlighted was just an example of the infirmary, where there's a young prisoner trembling because the doctor's telling him he's going to have to change his bandage. He's only 20, a young guy. He's got terrible bed sores, which usually that's something we'd associate with, very old or needy people, because he can't move enough, because he's lying prostrate on his bed for days on end, and it's eaten deeply into his leg. And the doctor in this situation, he's really insistent on the reporter there for Aid to the Church in Need, saying, you need to photograph these festering wounds. He says, I want the world to know what's happening here. The doctor says we have to fight for the provision of necessities like disinfectants and bandages, and that people in this prison, he says, with illnesses are doomed. And one of the things that the infirmary is used in this prison is to separate tuberculosis patients from the rest of the population. And the only furniture that's available is a hospital bed and a chair. The doctor also went on to show another malnourished patient with protruding ribs. He just needs proper meals. One of the things that Father Adrian wanted to try and do, and what he does in his work and his ministry, is that he's trying to find the best occupations for the prisoners. Interestingly, he shows an object that he has in his bag as if it was a valuable treasure, a trophy, because he's preparing something simple yet that's going to have an impact, just a football tournament, to put the prisoners in teams against one another. Obviously, one of the most important things for Father Adrian is fulfilling his duty as a priest and just bringing a breath of fresh air to the prisoners. And he has just consecrated a new chapel in part of the prison where young inmates aged under 18 are housed. He also had the pleasure of baptising 9 prisoners during the Easter 2023 celebrations. Now, among the prisoners was a former soldier who'd been involved in arms trafficking and banditry, and he was a repeat offender. But his request for baptism was the subject of questions and controversy. But in the end, he found the Lord, and he received the sacrament along with 8 other inmates. And one of the things that's important to highlight here is that Aid to the Church in Need is supporting this particular diocese of Bukavu in its efforts on behalf of this abandoned population in this prison. And they're also doing practical things like supporting the construction of places of worship and seminaries. So it was really great that Aid to the Church in Need did this interview with Father Adrian just about his ministry in the Bukavu prison, and we just need to pray for the situation there, because he is responding to the call that gave us, visiting those in prison. But it is very clear from the conversation that he had with Aid to the Church in Need that the conditions they are living in and the lack of dignity with which they are being treated, it truly is dire, and we need to keep them in our prayers. So I wanted to bring you a good news story about some of the work that Aid to the Church in Need has been doing in Sierra Leone. And recently Aid to the Church in Need spoke to Sister Gianna Smoroska, and she just wanted to talk a little bit about the project in Sierra Leone, which is construction of a kindergarten and pastoral centre for the congregation of the Sisters of Merciful Jesus. And she just told a little bit about the project and the work that they are doing.
We were able to renovate this building for our children, that from our area, from Cambia, the children, they can come to learn. They can come to get knowledge. And because of all of you who are the people with open hearts, who share with us the things that you have, we are able to renovate the building, to repair the roof, to make the bathroom. So for us in Europe, I think so that it is something normal. It is the standard of our life that we have those kind of things. But when you will see what is going on in Africa, you can discover that not only the level of education is low, the system of hospitals is low, but also the normal things what we have in our house. Many children, even our aunties, our teachers, they have never used toilets, for example, bathrooms. So for us, because we were able to do those things, we did this because of your support, and now we can teach them how to use it, how to improve our daily life, the level of our life. Our children, they are coming from Campi to our school every day, from Monday to Friday. They stay with us from 8 o'clock in the morning until 12 o'clock. And every day also, because they are coming to us, they can learn, they can study, they can play. But also every day, because of support of many people, they are able to get the hot meal, what is not so often is happen in our schools. So I think so that our children, they are happy, they are lucky that they are able to come here, they can come here. And also, like I said, I want to say the big thank you for all of you, for Church in Need, that you help us, you support us. And because of you, we have all those things what we can see now. Thank you so much.
And for our pastoral piece today, I'm joined by Father Nicholas, and we're going to be reflecting on today how we can best share our faith with people of all faiths and no faith. So, Father Nicholas, I know what got you thinking about this was a recent Mass reading. Tell us about that.
So, looking at the readings for this Sunday, preparing the Sunday sermon, there is a second reading, which is from the first letter of St. Peter, where Peter says to his recipients of his letter, and he says to us today, any member of the church, always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks for a reason for your hope.
So he's basically saying, make sure you're able to explain why you believe what you believe.
Yeah, like it's a no-brainer, but yes, that's exactly what he's saying.
Easier said than done, though.
Easier said than done, yes. Definitively, he's telling us that we should know our faith, be able to explain our faith. And this is the field of something called apologetics, which comes from the Greek word, I'm going to take a long shot here, I think you say it as apologeia. But
I won't argue with you.
but at least it's apologetics, coming from this Greek word, which basically means a formal defense of one's opinions or beliefs. It's not a negative thing. It's not about fighting and arguing and giving out and jumping up and down. It's a reasoned explanation of what we believe.
I think that sometimes that's what people struggle with, is that we might know in our hearts and in our intellect as well, I know I believe in God, but being able to articulate it can be quite difficult. And that involves a lot of time, a lot of study. And as you said, apologetics, it's the idea of informed, the reason why we believe what we believe. And I think some people get overwhelmed. So is there particular ways that we can start?
Yes, that's the way to go. I'd break it up into apologetics into three groups, actually. You have what we call natural apologetics, Christian apologetics, and Catholic apologetics. So, the natural would deal with the atheists,
Okay, so this is when we're speaking to people who are saying, look, I just don't believe there is a God. So you're saying, here's some reasons for God's existence.
Yes. So the atheists, even the agnostics. So it would be things like that. The existence of God. C.S. Lewis is a really good author on this. He wrote an excellent piece called Mere Christianity, which is really excellent.
There's a really good audio version of that book, by the way, where the audio of it's really engaging.
There is an excellent audio of that. It sounds like an old boy sitting by the fire in a leather armchair, but it's really good. You're right on that. If you want to go step it up a notch, you could read The 5 Ways of St. Thomas Aquinas on the existence of God, where you've got, or maybe a famous argument is the design argument, or the philosopher Pascal is very good as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Thomas Aquinas 5 Ways, for a lot of people, opens doors. Even just that idea of looking at the complexity of the world, saying, you know, the likelihood that this was an accident is like saying there happened to be an explosion in an alphabet factory and the dictionary just happened, you know, every single word, you know, saying that there has to be a designer to this universe.
That's exactly it, actually. That's exactly it. I've have this in my mind because giving a little teaching about Our Lady, it's the month of May, it's Our Lady's month of May. A kid, maybe not the best behaved kid in the class, he just blurted out, God doesn't exist. And he took the atheist position. He's a 12-year-old. He probably was regurgitating something he heard at home. And so I exactly gave him this argument that you just said. And it went down very well with this kid. So these are the kind of arguments that we're using in the natural apologetics. Also, though, you're talking about things like the existence of the soul, the immortal soul, of which the philosophers, again, have really struggled over for thousands of years. So that's that point.
Isn't it important as well to highlight to people that being a Christian, it's not blind faith. It's not like God doesn't say, just believe in me. You know, he wants it to be an act of the heart and the intellect. The heart and the mind go together. And that these big questions, perhaps he wants us to be looking for, as I say, the heart connection, but also the intellectual answers to them.
In the Catholic Church, Wendy, in particular, there are some Christian denominations where it's just the focus is on faith, but we're absolutely 100% in the Catholic Church, faith and reason. St. John Paul II actually wrote an excellent document on this called Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, where he really drives home this point. And it's worth a read, anyone who feels like they'd like an intellectual challenge. But if I may get back to my second point on the apologetics front, if we're talking to someone who is a Christian, this would be the Christian, or we're talking as Christians to people who believe in God, but they themselves are not Christians. So we might be...
That would be like the majority of the world, you know, any kind of piece of research that I've ever done. The majority of people say, I believe in God, but then it's kind of, for many, full stop. It doesn't actually have an impact on their life or how they live their lives.
Yes. But we're talking about, though, people, yes and no, to what you've said there, because we're talking about people who are believers, but they're not Christians. So all of the Muslim world, Jewish, Hindus.
So other faiths where we say, hey, have you heard about this guy called Jesus?
Exactly. And so what the focus here is on things which are Christian beliefs, such as the resurrection, the Holy Trinity, the incarnation, God assuming a human nature unto himself, becoming one of us. So these are things that Christians believe in amongst themselves, and which it's a common ground. And it's something that we would have to engage with other faiths in sooner or later if we're having a serious conversation. So that's the second group.
And I have to say, on that, one of the things I certainly found so useful many years ago was doing the Alpha course, when explaining, you know, some of the proofs for, you know, Jesus' existence. And I just give you one example of one thing that stuck with me from that was it going through the historical evidence for Jesus, saying, you know what, nobody questions the existence of Julius Caesar, yet there's more historical evidence, you know, documented by historians during Jesus' time and afterwards. There's more historical evidence for Jesus' existence than there is for Julius Caesar. that really got me. So there's so much information out there. There's so much evidence out there. I suppose it's up to us as Christians to make sure that we take on that responsibility of being able to understand it and explain it. So what's the third category then?
Third category is specifically what we'd call Catholic apologetics, because this would be the dialogues that Catholics have with other Christians, but who are not Catholics. So we will be defending or apologizing over things which are specific to the church. For example, the sacraments. So the Eucharist, the anointing of the sick, etc. And we would use in our defense the same sacred scripture that our Protestant brothers often tell us is all they believe in, because the scripture is absolutely full of texts which are the foundation of these beliefs. This is my body, this is my blood. It didn't say this is the spirit of myself. He said this is my body. Same with the sacrament of reconciliation, confirmation, the sacrament of the sick. It's all there with a solid foundation. So I suppose we're challenged to actually know some of these biblical texts. We don't need to know the Bible inside out, but we do need to know the fundamental texts which are related to our fundamental beliefs. Also, the church, that the church was founded by Jesus, that would be something that the Catholic would defend and apologise over. Also, the Pope, the primacy of the Pope, the primacy of Peter, the texts are there as well. And our Blessed Lady, of course. We're giving reasons to our Protestant brothers why we honour our Blessed Lady in a very particular way, why we believe the Pope has primacy, why we believe that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ, etc., etc.
I suspect for many people listening, myself included in that, by the way, when it comes to what you've been talking about, apologetics in terms of speaking to those who say they don't believe in God or are agnostic, speaking to those who have a faith other than Christian, that probably in the culture we're in here, certainly in the Western world, we're for the most part focusing on those first two categories.
Yes, we are. We are, but if you were to go to the United States, you would probably have many opportunities to also engage in the third category. But let's just... I like us as Christians to work together. So any person who feels they cannot make apologetics without arguing, getting angry and shouting, they should step away from it, because that's not what it's about. And it'll be a good place to start first with those who are not believers, like you say, and engage non-Christians and share with them our beautiful faith, our beautiful, beautiful faith, which we are obliged to a certain degree know, that we may, as St. Peter said, always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks for a reason for your hope.
Yeah, and isn't that the key? So he's talking about hope. You know, this idea of we are meant to be joyful as Christians. We are meant to be full of hope, not arguing and aggressive and angry and frustrated. So is that an important thing for us to make sure that we focus on in this communication, that we're doing it with hope, we're doing it with joy, because we want people to be attracted to us as Christians rather than turned off.
Exactly. That's it. 100%. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, well then we'll leave me with the last word. It's been great to have Father Nicholas with us for our pastoral reflection today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy.
And thank you so much for joining us on this month's Faith Under Fire podcast. This podcast was brought to you by Aid to the Church in Need Ireland. And if you want to stay up to date with the work that Aid to the Church in Need here in Ireland does, and indeed support their work, you can go to acnireland.org. I've been your host, Wendy Grace. It's been a pleasure to have you with me today. It'd be great if you could subscribe on your favourite platform, wherever you get your podcasts, and do share with family and friends. I'll talk to you next month. In the meantime, God bless you and all of your family.